I was in Montana this past weekend. My family and I flew up there for a wedding of some dear friends in Graycliff, one of the smaller sister communities of the one that's here in Waco. Brian and Eliza, the parents of the young bride, are the ones who first showed me what a truly abundant life looks like. And they didn't just open up their house and show me around the community where they're living, though they did do that. They opened their hearts and they showed me a glimpse of love and of life and of community that I had never seen before. Now, at the time we first met, Brian ran the farm here at Homestead, a couple of 100 acres on the bottomland just over the hill from where we're all sitting right now. And although he and the others who worked on the farm knew well how much easier it would have been to use tractors, they instead harnessed draft horses and used horse-drawn equipment to plow, to till, and to plant. I learned that they didn't just want to get the work done. They wanted to experience all that the work had to offer. To not just break the land and make it fruitful, but to let the land, in its way, break them and make them fruitful too. And later that day, after a beautiful dinner with a half a dozen other couples and families at Brian's house, where they served much of what they had grown or raised right here on the farm, everyone sat around the living room and they told stories and they laughed and they sang songs together until late in the evening. Now, I had been making music for a living for many years by then, and I was well known for it. But sadly, it had never really occurred to me to sit around with friends and sing just for fun. I would soon come to realize that since none of them, or any of the other 100 or so families in the community, had televisions, they had created a culture of being together and of entertaining themselves. Netflix couldn't hold a candle to the meals, the conversations, and the joy that sharing their lives and their evenings together brought. Like kids in the broader culture, the teenagers here were gamers, but they were the old school kind. Board games, card games, and dominoes were being constantly played together by the oldest to the youngest in just about every house, every evening, all the time. Now, Brian not only ran the farm, he had what seemed to be a dozen other business endeavors going on at one time, from dog and rabbit kennels to selling cookies and ice cream at the local farmers market, all of it designed to support a life where he could spend his days with his family and not have to be away from home. And it turned out that most of the other men in the community were doing the same thing. They were not getting rich, but they had enough to supply the kind of rich life that everyone here was after. And when their kids weren't helping with chores or tending the animals on the farm, Eliza homeschooled their children. The families here at Homestead were homeschooling back before homeschooling was cool. They began getting concerned about the compulsory education system in the late 1970s, and they started pulling their kids out of private and public schools. Back when parents were getting arrested and put in jail for it, their children taken away by the state. I would in time learn that the folks here wrote the book on homeschooling, literally. And when a couple of these families were taken to court and ultimately won the case, they helped turn the tide for homeschooling in the state of Texas and helped open the door for the 4 million families across America who homeschool today. Brian's father, Don, had become part of this community in the late 1980s when he was still a fairly young husband and father. A coal miner turned farmer, he had survived a near-death avalanche that would lead to him giving his life to God and joining a local church. But soon after, he'd come to realize that the gravitational pull of the world around them was too strong. And his family was going to need to be part of a spiritual vision that encompassed much more than just Sunday morning and Wednesday evening services. Don told me that when he first came to visit these folks, he knew he hadn't just found a church family. They had found a people who were searching for an order, a culture where life and love and faith could truly flourish, the way a garden with the right soil grows slowly, surely, and more beautifully than anything you could force into being on your own. When his 4 children were in their teens, Don's wife, Darla, passed away from cancer, surrounded by and cared for in every way by this community. I would learn in the 50-plus years since this church and this community began, not a single elderly person has ever been placed in a retirement home or died alone. A far cry from how most of the elderly in America spend their last days. A short time later, Don's best friend, Armando, another farmer here in the community, passed away suddenly while still in his 30s, leaving behind a widow and 6 young children. A couple of years after that, God put a burden of love in Don's heart, and he married Maria. And for the next 20 years, they raised all 10 of those children together. Now, Brian and his family all live in Montana, as do his brother and sister and his father, Don. All in houses side by side on a hillside overlooking the ranch there in Gray Cliff. Just one of the many smaller communities in places like Idaho, Israel, Virginia, Wisconsin, New Zealand, the Netherlands, that have all come out of this one in the last 15 years or so. This past year, Maria passed away. And now, Don, who has his own health struggles and is walking out his final season, is surrounded by the next generation of the same community who surrounded his loved ones before. Brian's oldest daughter, Darla, named after her grandmother, is the one who got married this past weekend, and I was privileged to be able to sing at their wedding. Her parents, Brian and Eliza, had been the best man and the maid of honor at Rebecca's and my wedding there in Montana 2 years ago. And so on Saturday evening, beneath the Absaroka Mountains, there we were, 300 people surrounding the young bride and the groom. Walter, the husband-to-be, is a gentle, soft-spoken young man who's been part of the community there in Montana for a couple of years now. He grew up Amish in Indiana, so he knows well what being part of a unique people is like. But several years ago, he made a change and he walked away from that life and made his way to a better one. He wanted more than rules, more than tradition, and more than a silent faith. He worked on ranches for a couple of years in the area until he found his way to Gray Cliff and found his way and his place in the community, and ultimately fell in love with Darla. As the ceremony went on and the pastor asked, "Who gives this bride?" Brian, fighting back tears, answered, "Her mother and I." I couldn't help but think about their story, Brian and Eliza's. How they had fallen in love and got married 20-something years ago. They knew each other, but not really. They had never dated, never even held hands before vowing to spend the rest of their lives together. Which is more than a little unusual to the rest of the world, but absolutely normal here. Growing up in a culture that takes the sanctity of marriage very seriously, the young people here don't date or try people on for size. Instead, they spend years praying that God will reveal, without anyone else's influence, exactly who He has for them. And when it happens, they share it only with their parents and their pastor, and then they wait. Unless the other person receives the same clarity and vision and quietly goes to their own parents and their pastor with the same conviction, nothing happens. As I looked around at the people surrounding Darla and Walter, I saw lots of other beautiful couples and love stories that I knew well, including Josh and Susie, now with a 1-month-old little boy in their lap. Josh, one of Brian's closest friends, didn't think that he was supposed to be married. So Susie, who knew early on that Josh was who God had chosen for her, silently waited and prayed for 5 long years. She never said a word to anyone until Josh, years later, felt in his heart and shared with his parents first that Susie Nolan was the one. When your very first kiss from anyone comes after the words, "I now pronounce you husband and wife," you are bound to have a marriage held together by something much, much stronger than what most marriages in today's culture are built on. Just last week, Rebecca and I had dinner with a couple here on the land who had never even had a conversation together before the day they got engaged. Not because they didn't want to, or because it was arranged or forced. At a young age, Stella had been diagnosed with an aggressive form of MS, and she heartbreakingly wondered who would ever want to marry someone who would most likely be in a wheelchair before she was 30. But at 16, in a dream, God put Jonathan's name and face on Stella's heart. And nervously, hopefully, that 16-year-old girl waited. A couple of years later, God put Stella's name on Jonathan's heart. And when she told us the story of the day her father came to her with the news that Jonathan had asked for her hand in marriage, I cried like a baby. Something I've done many times, listening to dozens of stories and love stories like that over the last few years. Later that evening, as their children and our little girl Indiana played around us, Jonathan asked Stella if she would like to go for a push. And together, he pushing his bride in her wheelchair, we walked slowly down the lane in front of their house. Jonathan is a master woodworker, and he, like most everyone in this community, has spent a lifetime learning skills that most people in today's fast-paced, disposable world have all but forgotten. This community is filled with folks gifted in everything from timber framing to weaving to sewing and pottery, blacksmithing, furniture making, glass blowing, you name it. If people were doing it 100 years ago, the folks here know how to do it. Their handmade cheeses, chocolates, and teas have won awards at some of the most prestigious competitions in the world. And the people here don't just learn these things for fun, although they do enjoy them. They recognize that in today's world, we have all become mostly just consumers. A people who don't know how to make, build, or fix anything. All that most of us know how to do is make money and buy stuff. The people here don't just want to be consumers, they want to be producers too, skilled and experienced in making the essentials of life with their own hands. In the days before Darla and Walter's wedding, the community had gathered around them for a shower, entirely put on by the community itself. No caterers, no outside chefs, no outside servers, because they see every one of these occasions as an opportunity to serve. And what about the gifts the newlyweds received? Almost all of them were handmade. Beautiful coffee and end tables, blankets, bedroom sets, crafted and given by friends. It has been that way here for 3 generations. When the young people get married, their friends hand make much of what they'll need for their first home. And in many of the older homes here today, their original wedding furniture is still being sat and played on by their grandchildren. The very first wedding I attended in the community was held under a beautiful, large timber frame pavilion. And I remember how the pastor shared that this new marriage was like 2 of these great oak timbers coming together in a corner joint, forming a union that wasn't there before, and that would make them stronger together than they would have been alone. But he also reminded the couple and all of us there that this new union was one of many that would form a much larger structure, the house of God. And it shouldn't be just about 2 people coming together to become one. It's about how their new union becomes part of something much, much larger, something that holds them up even as they hold it up together. A couple of years later, Rebecca and I got married beneath that same pavilion in Montana. We knew well that we did not want to be a union unto ourselves. We wanted to be part of God's larger design for marriage and for community, part of a commitment and a covenant of love with each other and also with the people around us. When Darla and Walter's ceremony ended, we all walked across the field to the large building where the reception was being held. And as we walked, the men were all dressed nicely and the women in their dresses and their skirts. But they weren't dressed that way just for the wedding. That's how these folks dress all the time. The women, the elderly ladies, and the young girls alike all dress pretty much the same here. Simple dresses and skirts, hair up, without makeup. Honestly, it's often the thing that makes people most skeptical about a community like this. Why do the women have to wear dresses and skirts? Why do they have to wear their hair up like that? And I'll admit, I wondered the same thing when I first came here. I had seen enough cult documentaries over the years, and I remembered what happened with Jim Jones and David Koresh. But I think that because most of us have never seen anything positive when it comes to churches or communities that take seriously Christ's call to come out of her, to actually make an effort to leave behind the trappings of this world, we assume by default that when it happens, when people actually begin to do it, it must be something dangerous or forced or broken. Our culture has trained us to believe that any other culture, different from the one we're used to, has to be wrong. But the truth is, it's just the exact opposite. The people here dress the way they do because they want to. They choose to. No one person here is trying to display their wealth, their beauty, or their individuality. They, my wife and I included, are tired of competing, tired of trying to express themselves through what they wear, through what they have, the kind of house they live in, the kind of car they drive. It's fun for a while, but in the end, most of us figure out that keeping up with the Joneses is a race that none of us can win. And we have discovered the incredible freedom that comes from letting go of competition and instead learning how to be part of something much greater than ourselves. The peace and the joy that comes when what you think, what you say, and what you do all move in harmony with each other. I love the way the Amish put it. You English spend your lives trying to find yourselves. We spend our lives trying to lose ourselves. Trying to get rid of our egos, our prides, our personal desires, giving ourselves up to our families and to each other and God's will for our lives. I've personally lived both ways, and the first one, living for ourselves, is easy. Everybody's doing that. But if you really want to be free, try doing something that the rest of the culture isn't doing. You'll find out quickly who your friends are. Now, try doing 100 things no one else is doing, and that's where life really starts to get interesting. Here's another one of those unique things. Most of the babies born in this community are just that, born right here, literally. For nearly 50 years, the families here have been having their babies at home the way it was done for most of human history. Before a couple of generations ago, when medicine and hospitals gave us the option to bypass most of the pain, schedule our births on our own timeline, and if we're honest, fit them around the doctor's tea time at the golf course. Like so many other essentials of life, our children's education, our elderly's final years, our food, our entertainment, we have outsourced the birth of our children to institutions, mostly for efficiency's sake. And around the same time the folks here brought their kids home from school, they brought their babies home too. They don't have home births here because it's easier. It is not. They do it because they believe it's more natural. And they found that it is way, way more meaningful. Ask any woman here who has had a baby at home and she will tell you she got to be fully present for one of the most extraordinary moments of her life. Not in a strange place, but at home. Surrounded not by strangers and scrubs, but by the people who love her, her mother, her sister, her closest friends, people who don't just say they care, they show up and they stay with her. Easier isn't always better. Usually it's the opposite. The harder something is, the more it tends to mean to us. By having our babies or educating our kids or producing our own food or entertaining ourselves, by bringing as much of our lives as possible back to the home, these folks are doing something very, very rare in the world today. Taking full responsibility for life itself, and in doing so, they are more fully alive. Back at the wedding reception, I sat down next to Brian's dad, Don, and an older gentleman that everybody calls Grandpa Steve. He isn't related to them at all except by love and by loss. A balding man in his mid-70s from Chicago, Steve had been a stock trader for 30 years and a wildly successful businessman. He knew well what abundance looked like, at least he thought he did. Homes in different places, new sports cars, European vacations, you name it, he had it. When Don's wife, Darla, was going through chemo and radiation, through a friend of a friend, two very different worlds met. Don and Darla stayed in Steve and Jer's Chicago home, and they could not have been more different. One couple had it all and yet felt empty. The other had nothing but each other and a deep-rooted faith that everything would be okay, even if it wasn't. At 57, Grandpa Steve gave the life he had been living up for a different one. And he'll be the first one to tell you that the life before was really no life at all. That he went down beneath the water an old man and came up a newborn child taking his very first breath. And that you're never too old to be born again. I see him often on Sunday mornings right here. Near the front row at church, a big smile on his face, hands in the air, tears rolling down his cheeks, having finally found a treasure that no moth or rust can destroy. Just down from where we were sitting was another Brian, one who had made the drive over from the community in Idaho just to be at the wedding. He was born here in Waco. Brian's father was one of the old-timers, part of the early group from New Jersey in the 70s, who had started the exodus out of the prevailing culture and began searching for a new one. Brian grew up knowing all that his father and that the generation before had sacrificed to build something worth living for, but he had his own will and his own plans. He wasn't like them, he told himself. He was going to do something with his life. And as a young man, he left to make his mark on the world. 12 years later, the life he had been living had left its mark on him instead. Dangerously close to death, lying in a bed in a drug rehab center, he cried out to God in desperation. And the Lord told him that if he would trust him and start living for him, he would give him a new life. Fast forward to now and the wedding, and that Brian is a respected pastor, happily married with a couple of little ones of his own. I don't think I've ever met anybody with a bigger smile or a bigger laugh or who is as filled with life and love as Brian is. There isn't a lost cause that he can't find hope for, and I can feel it every single time he puts his arms around me and tells me he loves me. As the newlyweds cut their cake and we all lit sparklers and we sent them off on their honeymoon, knowing that they'd already decided to build their lives and raise their family there in the Montana community, I couldn't help but think about all the other stories around me and the ones in the other communities and here in this one. Each one very different, but also the same. Here in this place, there are former drug dealers and doctors, plumbers and public school administrators, runway models and restaurant workers, architects and attorneys, some at the end of their ropes having tried everything the world offered and finding it hollow, others well off by the world's measuring stick but quietly miserable. All of them searching for a different kind of abundance, an order and a vision for how life and family and community are meant to work together. And then, of course, there are folks like me who spent their whole life chasing and catching a dream, only to find that it was just that, a dream. When I got to the end of the rainbow, there was nothing there, nothing meaningful that could fill the longing that was in my heart. Like Grandpa Steve, from the outside, it appeared that I had it all. Fame, fortune, Grammy awards, a beautiful farm in Tennessee, and a story that millions of people followed. And yet I was always searching for something that was missing, trying to figure out how to be a family, how to be in community. Through the years, I would painfully learn that proximity, shared interest, a cross around your neck, or even the same blood running through your veins are not the essential things that are going to make real community or sustain us when life gets difficult. It is a dying to yourself in a way that you never even knew was possible, finding your place in the order and the pattern of life with a group of believers who too have died the same death, and then finally letting the Holy Spirit lead you every moment of every day. And even then, it is nothing short of a miracle. When I found this community, I found people who had been quietly living and seeking out the same deeper truths for decades before I had ever stumbled in. People who had been making difficult, inconvenient, countercultural choices for 50 years because they wanted a life and a love for each other that would last and live on after they're gone. In the book of John, Jesus says, "I have come that they may have life and that they may have it more abundantly." And I want to tell you this morning that that abundant life is possible. And finding it is what this conference is all about. I can't begin to tell you how excited we all are that you are here, that you took the time out of your busy schedules to come and spend the next 3 days with us. We pray that, like the banner that usually hangs right above us here says, that God will work in your days which you will not believe, though it be told you. It has happened here. It is happening in other places, and it can happen in your life too. Thank you.